I think, Biju, you were about to ask something?
Uh, you mentioned the archiving project, the museum.
Yes.
One important, some sort of connection I've seen in the question of history and how the concept of history is illustriously employed in, say for example, history as, and this is something like digging up. We dig because that was the methodology definitely followed by the colonial historians.
Yes.
And as Damodar Prasad said at the beginning, the official, the dominant, very dominant academic historians, a group of academic historians, wanted to follow that path in some sense. They are very concerned about, archaeological excavations.
Yes.
Scientific, rational approach to
yes.
objects and history and
yes.
everything, conceptualizations.
Yes.
And at the same time, in certain points, when they find certain missings, they definitely go on interpreting, bring the narrative to fill the gap, etc.
Yeah.
And this, mainly the academic historians, do you think are they equipped to follow the rational, scientific, objective
yes.
Path of history?
Yes.
Interprofessionality.
Yes.
I have a connecting question, sir. Which is related to the temporality of history. Even this academic work of history, where you have this, you have already picked up in time, there is a temporal sense of the linear sense of history.
Yes.
Where history, you start from very primitive time. This is the history that Marxists follow,
yes.
follow, natural historians follow.
Yes.
And in that sense, we can also think of any kind of a non-linear forms of history.
Yes, yes, yes.
Very different from the linear consciousness.
Yes.
So it will be more empathetic to ecology. It will be very critical of Anthropocene kind of the kind we have. So we will imagine history as in a different way, and it is not human centered.
Yes. Well, there are quite a few different things in all that's been mentioned right now. So there is a question of linear versus so-called cyclical history. This is, by the way, a very old question. And the typical Western way of dealing with it was to, in fact, argue exactly what you're saying, that look, actually in the East, they don't have a linear conception of history. Whatever the East might mean, because, of course, colloquially, you and I know that it means China, Japan, India, the Orient. But these are all quite different civilizations. I think we also have to be a little wary of this idea that if you're east of the Suez Canal, we're all alike. I think that fundamental differences, for example, between the Chinese and the Indian. There may be some similarities, but the Chinese, for example, have had a very profound sense of history and historiography for a very long period of time. Unquestionably so, to my mind. Right? Much more and much more akin in some ways to the European interest in history. So there are several questions. As I said, one has to do with the question of linear versus cyclical history or other forms of history. Why does it have to be incidentally only those two? You could have a history that goes linear and then there's a little loop, and then it goes linear and then there's a little loop. If you had to do it as a diagram, you could do 7-8 ways, I would argue, of actually thinking about time, right? So that's one set of questions. Then there's a set of questions which has to do about the European. You pick the metaphor of the archaeologist and the historian and the archive, and the archaeologists are working, as you were trying to suggest, in a similar kind of mode. You're looking for hard data. You're trying to create an objective account of the past. And just to anticipate my answer there, let me tell you that you can try to create that, but let us not forget one thing, that there is still the problem of representation. That is, that someone does the digging, recovers the facts, you still have to represent them in a certain way, right? And there, now you're already in a different modality. When I was in Delhi a few months ago, I went to the National Museum on Janpat. They have completely redone the Indus Valley civilization galleries. Okay? The most astonishing thing I found was the standard account that we knew for 100 years, and that I'm sure you read, both of you and I read in school, going to school in India, was that there was a man called Mortimer Wheeler, right, who was largely responsible in the first place for, digging up the sites, for alerting us to the presence of Harappa, and then, they discovered other Indus Valley sites, Mohenjo-daro, Lothal, much later on, so forth and so on. So guess what? When you look at the panel now, because I'm sure this was done under the BJP government now, all the archaeologists who are shown in the photographs are Indians. The white man isn't even there. Just not there. I mean, and I'm sure that the new generation is learning that the white man had nothing to do with it. He had nothing to do with creating the sites or recovering them or digging them up. He was just a ghost. So the archaeologist was doing the positivist thing, digging it up, putting out the bones, reconstructing, looking at the layers and the sediments, but then you still have to represent it. This is where we get into the question of the politics of representation. Right? So it's never going to be enough to have a positivist account. I mean, and this is what we always learned from, that was what the film Rashomon was about in one way. The classic example that the same incident is replayed 3 different times or 4 different times, and each person's narrative looks very different. But I found this when I was looking at the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, because I wrote a massive dissertation on this thing called Committees of Inquiry, appointed to look into law and order problems. And around the Jallianwala Bagh, they had the official commission, and then they had the Congress committee. But if you look at the evidence, you see the people who saw what was happening saw different things. So it's never going to be enough to rely simply on perception, or even to say that, well, there is this hard data, okay. But let me put it in this way, because I want to broaden it out, since we've only been looking really at history of history for the most part and questions around it. Because ultimately that is related to things I've been hinting at. The larger project is a project to try to understand what the politics of knowledge is and what are the categories through which we think about the world. And the museum has come up. It came up when I talked about the museum, the Holocaust museum, and then the plan to have a Jewish museum, and then Biju, you just mentioned, the museum too. Now yesterday I went to Guruvayur, and I was expecting to find one thing, and I found it. I don't think anyone goes to Guruvayur with that purpose, but I went with that one purpose. For me, that was enough. I knew. I was quite sure that the transformation of the temple into a museum is starting to take place. Let me explain what I mean. By this, I do not mean that worship will discontinue over a period of time. No. What I mean rather is that the temple, like every other institution, is now being used as an occasion for pedagogy. So whatever they have done in Guruvayur, they have put up these large sculptures in white of various Hindu gods, saints and bhakti poets. So they had one of Vyasa, Okay? Well, what is Vyasa doing in Guruvayur? You think to yourself, whoever Vyasa might have been, I know of course he's supposed to be the alleged author of the Mahabharata, plus 50 other works. He must have been very busy with 10 arms, given the length of these works. And frankly, exactly. I mean, he's just in a sense a kind of a fiction. He's a scribe of some kind who's writing, right? But let's suppose he's a historical figure, which I don't suppose for a moment. But let's suppose there is someone called Vyasa. What is he doing in Guruvayur? You know, right? Because what's happening here is that the museum modality has now become a part of our modernity. And the most extraordinary example of that is what the Swaminarayan people have done. You ever go to the Swaminarayan temples, it's extraordinary. When I say extraordinary, I don't mean it as a term of approbation. I mean it's just bizarre. It's not bizarre to me because I know exactly, at least I think I know, what is moving them to put up their temples in this way. So in some parts of the US, in London, in Canada, they have put up these monumental temples. And when I say monumental, I mean really monumental. You know, of course, Akshardham in Delhi, which I would not describe as an aesthetically pleasant place, very garish. The ones that they put up in outside Chicago, a place called Bartlett, in Atlanta, a number of other places, I've been to all of them because I've tried to document what's happening there. These are all, by the way, temples that cost in the vicinity of 40 to 80 million US dollars each. Talking about huge sums of money. But that's not the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing is that each of them is a museum as well. It's a museum to Hinduism. It's a museum to Hindu glories. So what I started off today, an hour ago, this little anecdote about the video that was sent to me by this Indian scientist. In these Swaminarayan temples, they'll have a whole plaque. And there is a strategy there. So they'll tell you that the first university in the world was founded in India. The first hospital in the world was founded in India. The first rocket scientist was Indian. And you know, if I go there or someone else who's a bit educated goes there and has not been completely seduced by this narrative, you think to yourself, this is all absurd. But to make it plausible, they tell you a few things that are true as well. So for example, they'll tell you that the idea of zero was invented in India, which is generally acknowledged to be the case, right? And they'll tell you that the first surgery may have been performed in India, which is possible. You know, there's some evidence about, we have texts of surgery. But then they'll tell you that aeronautic surveillance, you know, spy aircraft, that these are all found in the Mahabharata, you know. Right? Now, but by the way, which is again a very good illustration of the historical mode. Most left-wing people see that they say this is all myth. They are thinking of this, the Swaminarayan, for them, the necessity of proving that we had this goes back to their interest in history. Myth is what you cannot prove, what you cannot establish. Right? This is for them very much a part of the historical mode. But what is more interesting is this, that our religion is becoming museumized. Hinduism is actually becoming museumized by the Swaminarayan people and by institutions such as Guruvayur. They may not at all be sensitive to what they are doing. Because to museumize the religion is to reify it, to objectify it. Then you put up these saints, you give them names, you make them real in a certain way. The idea is that the children who are going through, they're going to learn their Hinduism from this, you see. So a temple is no longer just a place for worship or for puja or what it has always been. That is a form of community formation. Now I was telling Shyam yesterday that as a strict non-believer, I still think temples have their use because at least people are coming together. There is some kind of community formation. They're not just on social media all the time. In the temple, you can't take your phone, thank God, right? At least there's one place where you can't take your phone. So it has its uses that we can be very clear about. But what is really transpiring here is the museumization of Hinduism. And when you museumize it and you put it in the museum modality, it entails various other kinds of standardization that you need. And what is, of course, the most extraordinary, arresting, and lovely thing about this thing called Hinduism is its largely anarchic, decentralized character. Now, when you start to museumize it, and many temples start to do it, that anarchic element, that decentralized element will disappear. Because the narratives will start to become similar. They'll start to converge. Right? And that, I'm saying to you, that happened at, I yesterday went to Guruvayur. I was quite certain I would find that going on, and I did find it. But really, if you go to the Swaminarayan temples, it's on a grand scale, the way that they do it. And of course, they have also followed the corporate form, because like in, that this is Indian museums haven't learned to do it yet. They'll learn it. You know what, that in the US and in Europe, you cannot pass out of a museum except through the gift shop. You always exit through the gift shop to make sure that before you go, you spend another $20 buying a little postcard of Van Gogh or Picasso or whatever. It's a corporatized museum. We are only museumizing, but very soon we'll be doing the corporatized museum form of the temple. And that the Swaminarayan people have started, because the Swaminarayan people, when you go to their temples, you exit through the gift shop. To me, it's remarkable. And I'm sure that to them, they would say it's, after all, the Gujaratis, a Gujarati friend of mine asked me, lovely chap, passed away a few years ago, Dr. Manu Pathari. I was having a conversation with him, and he's a Gujarati. So he himself said to me, Vinay, what's the holy book of the Gujaratis? And I knew that when Manu Bhai asked that question, there was some trick involved here. This was not a simple question. That if I said, the Bhagavad Gita, that he would chuckle and he would laugh, because there was some trick up his sleeve. But I nonetheless ventured, I thought about it then I said, maybe the hymns of Narsi Mehta. Yeah, he said, give it another try. I said, I know it's not the Gita or this or that. Why don't you just tell me? He says, it's very simple. The holy book of the Gujaratis is the checkbook. And you go to the Swaminarayan Mandir, and it's there. All you need to do now is blow up a blank check, and make an art of it.
Such a project of museumization is actually going on in Kerala also, where we have invented something called the Museumized, the first famous fort in Kerala. There is an excavation going on.
I'm familiar with it. Museumized, yes.
So
yes.
There is a huge museum.
Yes.
The places are
Yeah.
There is a concept of museum, related places,
Yeah.
Related temples or
Yes.
churches, synagogues. There is a synagogue, all part of this museum.
That's right. But that is what I mean by the sense of fait accompli that I spoke to you about. We're not going to be able to arrest that trend. But at least we should be wary of it. We should be skeptical. We should ask questions. Why is our culture now all being contained in museums? And that museum, incidentally, that enterprise, because you could say to yourself, once you've done the archaeological digging, the Museumized project has now shown that there were long established links between the coast and Rome, right? Okay, so obviously you'll say, look, if they're doing something like that, then they're going to have to put the objects in some kind of space that you call a museum, so on and so forth. And there are two questions that really arise here. One, I'm saying, is that, look, in some ways it is a fait accompli. I understand that, right? But the real question behind that, and there are museums and museums, they're different kind of museums, they're not all alike. And some people who are very sensitive to this fact have tried to create museums that don't follow the kind of conventional models we had for museums. But that's the same thing as what's happening in history, or that is that you drift away from the familiar narratives, you try to create the same one, but the same question still arises. Why do we now try to apprehend the past through the museum? But the museum is a subsection of the historical modality. Right? Okay. Why is it done through the museum? And interestingly enough, while we are acknowledging these links with Africa and the African coast and Rome, that when an African comes here, we beat him up. What's the point? I want to understand if there may actually be a relationship. That when we put it into a museum, this exonerates us now from having to think about the African in our midst. You know, I want to put it that strongly, whether there may actually be a strange kind of relationship. And I think that as the West has increasingly museumized, most of its culture is now museumized. There are thousands of museums. There are museums to every possible thing you can think about. Museum of plastic, museum to furniture, you know. As increasingly the West museumizes its culture, it's becoming less and less capable of living with real difference, I find it. So this is why these questions become important. You know, it's not that there is any intrinsic academic argument to be made, but it has to do with how we understand culture, how we live with cultural difference, and so on. Yes.
So